on this. We're talking about a specific police shooting that got some headlines, and everyone was up in arms about it. They're like another unjustified police shooting of this time a young black woman. Oh my God, go ballistic. When we watched the actual body cam, it turns out that the lady was trying to stab people. Like in the act of stabbing someone, the cop says essentially get off of her. So there's three people in the yard, and then there's a cop, and then the lady holding a knife, and there's a woman on the ground. She's trying to stab the woman. The cop runs over, I think maybe gives her a shove and says, no, 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 get off her, or whatever. And so then she turns around, takes the knife, and proceeds to be in the act of stabbing another woman. Right? And then the cop fires 3 shots, and she dies. And I contend that that's justified for basically 2 reasons. One is this isn't a debate about anything besides whether you want to preserve the good people or the evil people, right? If you think that the evil people ought to be preserved over that of the innocent, then, I mean, obviously, you have to side with my opponent. Because if you believe that all else being equal, we ought to save the good person from harm. So you can think of it like a trolley problem, right? On one track, there is the good, innocent person. On the other track of this trolley problem, there is an evil, violent person, right? Who's attempting to murder people. Which will you pull the switch and kill the violent, evil person, or will you let, in this case, the 2 good, innocent people perish? And that is the real question. If you think that evil is better than good, then, I mean, we have some very difficult definitional problems, and I think you probably should get some help. But I think all of us would agree that given the requirement, then you have to side with the innocent. The second point, which I think is going to be more for my opponent to prove, and I'd like to just signpost it for those listening to the debate, is the fact that you have to hold that the shooting was unjustified in this case means that there is a presence of a better alternative, or an alternative that should have been taken. And my question is to my opponent, and I guess I'll give the floor here, is what alternative did the police officer have? Was he to let the person get stabbed? Was he just to yell and scream at the heavens until a social worker arrived? Should he have, quote, de-escalated the situation by walking away while watching someone get stabbed to death? Like, what's the alternative here? And those are my 2 points, essentially.
Well, I think that it's important to preface this by saying that I am going to concede half of the point that the shooting was in some ways justified by the police officer. Okay. However, morally, I think is a much larger question that can be answered, because in the split second of the moment, I personally believe that he did what was correct for the situation. I'm going to say that out loud. It might shoot myself in the foot, but I do believe that personally. However, I think the question comes as to whether it was morally correct and the situation that led up to what happened, because it actually came out rather recently that in actual fact, the girl was living in an abusive home with foster parents, and in effect, a bunch of people had just come to her house to jump her, and her stepfather had just told her to go out and fight. She was a very quiet girl. She, exactly what you'd call the violent type, or at least not from what I've seen personally. There could be evidence on that I'm not aware of, but it is an ongoing investigation, so we can't really speculate. So, whilst I do think that the shooting was correct in the situation, I rather think what could have been done to prevent the situation as a whole, because I don't think the entire situation was morally correct at all. I don't think it should have happened, and I don't personally think that the girl can be held accountable, because for all we know, she was going through a rather difficult mental break at the time. She could have been, as you say, you're siding with the side of evil, but in actuality, we don't know whether that girl was evil. She could have been terrified for her life. I mean, what would you do as a 16-year-old if a bunch of people come to your house where you've got a violent stepfather who is shown on camera kicking her whilst this is going on in front of the police officer. What? Bollocks! I just lost my train of thought. Sorry, but God.
Take your time.
It'll come to me. I'm sorry.
On the table, man, and then we can go piece by piece.
That was it. But what I really think is whether it was morally correct. As I said, she was scared. She could have been going through a mental episode. Was it correct to shoot her? In that instance, I'm going to say possibly. I think the cop had a split-second decision to make. He made a decision. I can't really say whether it was correct or incorrect, as well, we'll never know whether there were any actual other options because what's happened. But I think that perhaps, like you said, he couldn't wait for a social worker to come up or anything like that. He had to make a spur-of-the-moment decision. But what I think is the key issue here is if we look at the body camera footage, we see the girl standing far away, and as soon as the police arrive, which is kind of weird to me, she sprints at the girl, gets tackled, sprints at the other girl, and then 4 shots are unloaded in her chest, which I will give credit to the cop, very clean shots. But, my point being, how do we know whether it was actually justified? As a teenage girl has died who was quite possibly going through one of the scary situations of her life. I mean, you imagine, that's my train of thought. You imagine you're a 16-year-old, people come to your house, you're living with an abusive family, and you're terrified for your life. You don't know what's going to happen. And then a bunch of people with guns show up. You're completely out of your head. You're on fight or flight mode. You just go. Perhaps there was a way that the situation could have been de-escalated. For example, if the police officer hadn't been carrying a pistol, I believe 5.7, kind of iffy on that one. But if he'd been carrying a taser, for example, as there are many situations in Europe where very, very similar things, if not almost identical things, have happened, wherein both parties have come out completely unscathed, and the party who would represent the girl in this case would have got mental help, would have been treated properly, would have been seen by the CPS, and it could have gone on a lot better. You portray them as being some, evil person just stabbing people, but the real question is, why would a quiet, shy, and all in all introverted 16-year-old girl who, let's face it, is a bit of a chunky monkey, she's not really going to go after anyone. Why would she be brandishing a knife on her driveway, and not only that, but be so out of the moment that even when she sees the police arriving, still decides to try and attack somebody? I don't think that we can paint her as evil, and I frankly think that you're putting up a straw man argument there by saying that, because we honestly don't know the whole facts of the situation. And on top of that, I think that there's a lot of questions that need to be answered, especially on the side of the family. For example, we've seen an abusive stepfather. We've seen a teenage girl in such distress that she tries to basically kill 2 people with a knife in front of the police. We don't know whether she was good or bad, and frankly, it's not our place to put that label on her. There will be a formal inquest, and like I said, I don't want to get into speculation in this debate. But
yeah. I think you gave an excellent case and just a little bit of propositional analysis on the actual debate prop, which I think is kind of important, and I think you're making a very astute point here. So, in order for me, let me find this stupid. Okay, yeah. Debate discussion, debate request. Okay, yeah. So I mean, you're basically ceding to the point that the officer didn't. You're saying, look, the officer did not do anything morally wrong, given his position. Am I correct on that?
Yeah.
But I mean, of course, right. And what you're sort of hinging at, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that I have to prove an and statement. So I don't just have to prove that the officer didn't do anything morally wrong, but I also have to prove that the shooting itself, that the shooting was justified. And you're seeming to be saying that, look, the entire situation, when taken as a whole, is not a morally justifiable situation that anybody should be put in, correct? Essentially.
Reasonably saying, yes.
Okay. Well, like so like the specific points is, well, okay, is it morally correct, for example, that this stepfather figure in the foster home or whatever the hell was being abusive and basically threatened and used force or fear of force as a coercion or direct physical violence in order to make Ma'Khia Bryant fight these people, correct?
It's possible. That is speculation, but considering what we
Yeah,
see in the
sure.
body cam footage, it's a reasonable assumption.
Let's just assume it's true. Right.
Yeah.
Let's assume that that's
For
true.
the sake of argument, yeah.
Right. But now, like, the reason why I think that this whole situation, and I characterize her as, being a terrible person stabbing people, is that the cops are there. Right. And so if this is all true, right, why is it, right, that instead of then dropping the knife and doing what you should do in such a situation, if you've been forced and coerced into it, you should immediately drop the knife. The cops are there. If the stepdad's going to attack her, then the cops will shoot him, right? She's safe at that point, right? So why do you go on and keep stabbing people? That's the question.
Well, I think the way that you have to look at it is more than likely the fact that she was probably suffering some sort of mental break. I mean, I fairly certain we can both agree that most normal people would not go on to just stab people in front of the police. I mean, even people in the hood who are well known for being complete lunatics addled on drugs, even they don't just pull up on the police. So I think it shows there was some kind of extreme mental duress, or at the very least extreme distress. What I'm thinking of is probably some kind of psychotic break due to stress in this situation that caused it to go off like that.
Right, sure. But now, right, it's like, okay, this may have been caused by some immoral actions by others, right? But the fact remains that she's in that mental state. Now the question is, what alternatives are you thinking that this situation could have gone down in? Right? We have a mentally unstable person who is having some level of mental break, whether psychotic or not. I don't know all the psychological definitions, and it's kind of unimportant, right? But they're in this altered mental state.
Yeah,
right?
Let's just say that they're not aware of their own actions, if you will.
Sure.
That's just a blanket term, because that'll work.
Sure. Yeah, they're just not aware of their own actions, right? Sure, I'll go with that. I think that's a great definition for these purposes.
It's
right?
easier.
And the question is, what alternative do you suppose that this situation is going to go down in now that we have a person who is completely oblivious, who is stabbing people, right? Which could cause great bodily harm or death, right? What should we do about that?
Well,
right?
I mean,
she's got the knife and she's on him. It's not like these common situations where there is like a standoff type of situation, right? This is usually how this shit goes down, right? There's a standoff situation. Someone's either suicidal or threatening people or doesn't want to come out to the cops. And so then you send in a good number of people, one with lethal, one with less lethal. You have multiple people there. And it's usually just that one person, or if it's a hostage situation, which is more applicable, you just shoot them on the spot, right? It's not the type of situation where there's time to deploy the taser, assess if the taser is working, drop the taser, then draw the gun, because is there only one cop there, or are there two? There's four cops there. Okay, so they may have been able to have someone fire the taser, and they don't have that time to drop and draw. So like you're losing, like, I don't know, half a second. Something, you're gaining like half a second there. But
well, I'll grant you that.
But it's like you have the cop waits until she's in the act of stabbing someone, right? She's in the action of doing it. If he does nothing, that woman's getting stabbed, right?
But couldn't you say that his inaction before that, when she was on the ground almost next to him and three other police officers, couldn't you say his inaction in keeping her to the ground and restraining her with his fellow officers led to Yeah, she had a knife, but she
She
was
has a
on
knife,
the
but
floor.
Her arms are free.
Her arms are free, but you can easily restrain somebody's arms with 3 people.
Yeah, sure, but the 3 people aren't all around her, and she's stabbing someone. She could stab the cop.
Well, no, we're talking about when she comes stumbling down the driveway after the first person.
Yeah.
You know, that she's directly next to the police officer. This police officer had 2 police officers behind him, as we see later on in the body cam footage. After she's shot, they come from behind. So those 3 officers could have easily physically restrained her when she was going down, without much. Granted, there would be some risk of harm, but granted, in a situation like this, there is always risk of harm. But we'll say, for the sake of argument, some slightly more advanced risk of harm to the police officers, but that could have resulted in a non-lethal takedown of the assailant, as well as preventing any deaths and, granted, the controversy that happened. So there were alternatives to the option, as well as if they had a taser. It's a 16-year-old girl. I mean, no offense, but you can be a jacked bodybuilder at 15. A taser's still going to take you down. You're not like a 40-year-old man.
She is wearing multiple layers of clothing, though.
But with skin exposed. I mean, granted,
Yeah,
that is like saying, could you pinpoint a shot or grant?
Yeah, now this is not only are tasers more widely more inaccurate than bullets, right? But you need both probes to hit, right? And so now we're in video game Fallout VATS land, where you have to aim the inaccurate thing, which is going to take time to do. Right, most likely you're going to shoot center mass, and she's wearing a hoodie. That's very thick. I've seen so many videos of people wearing hoodies where you shoot them with the taser, and the probes can't penetrate through the multiple layers of clothing, right? And I mean, too, the other thing is she's basically on her knees on top of this other person, right? The police officer, right, is also there. He can't, when she's already down on the ground like that. It takes more time, and he has to go in a more disadvantaged position to restrain her, which is time that he gets stabbed. Right? He's getting stabbed while trying to restrain her, and in that position, right? I think, even if you have 2 people, someone's getting cut, I think. And then again, we're in the situation: do we preserve the good or preserve the evil? Right? Because we agree that what she's doing, her action at least, maybe she's not aware of it, but that's a type of evil, right? Type of wrong.
Well, it may be a type of wrong, but like I said, we don't actually know the full situation that played out. And unfortunately, the people that were there were also committing acts of wrong. They were all adults, and they were trying to beat the shit out of a 16-year-old girl. I mean, you're kind of balancing 2 wrongs don't make a right. So I don't really think there is a good or a bad in this situation. Granted, I'll admit the police probably are the good, if there is any in this, because they did resolve the situation. But rather unfortunately, a 16-year-old girl lost her life. A 16-year-old girl.
Arguing that it's not tragic. I'm not arguing that it isn't tragic.
No. But a 16-year-old girl lost her life. Could something have been done to prevent that? Are the surrounding the situation, are they relevant to whether it was morally correct? I do believe so. I think that there was a viable alternative rather than just laying 4 rounds straight into the center of mass and putting her on the ground.
The thing is, this is happening so quickly that every time, right, that you're going to take time, one, to assess the situation, which is very difficult this quickly. Right, we're all sitting back here being armchair body cam analysts, like, you could have done this, you could have done that. I mean, it's almost like if you watch like motor racing, for example, you're like, oh, he could have turned his steering wheel 0.5 degrees to the left, and it would have been better for him, right? But in the moment, you can't be sitting back analyzing every possibility and every piece of information. And I think that, right, when you're applying these non-lethal means, I mean, at what point? So another way to phrase it is, how much stabbing is justified until we are allowed to pull the trigger on a gun? That's the real question of this case, I think.
Well, first off, I'd vehemently disagree that it's not our job to take apart every single fact of the case, because unfortunately that is what we we have to do, because if we didn't, well, if there was a viable mean, it doesn't matter how hidden it may be, it doesn't matter how
Sure.
buried under the covers it is. If
All
there
right.
was a viable mean, then there was a viable mean. It doesn't matter whether he saw it or not.
I'll grant that. I will pull back and grant that.
But on the case of how much stabbing should we allow before we pull the trigger, well, I'll ask you this: how many people got stabbed that day? How many people actually were physically injured that day?
Only, from my understanding, it's only the 16-year-old who got killed.
Exactly. So technically, according to your argument, then it doesn't really matter. No stabbing is necessary so long as you're holding a knife for somebody to pull the trigger.
No, that's not my view at all. She's in the act of stabbing.
Well, she had the opportunity to stab the girl on the ground. She had a clear shot at the girl on the ground as well, but she didn't actually take the opportunity to stab her.
Yeah, but this is happening so quickly that all you really see as a human being in this situation is somebody assaulting someone else with a knife. You can't really assess in the moment if the stab is actually connecting or not. You just see someone assaulting someone else with a knife.
I still do believe that there was a less than lethal, at least, if not non-lethal, outcome to this situation. I do think the police officer perhaps not acted rashly in pulling the gun, but I do think that he hesitated quite a bit, considering he had the time from when she started running with the knife in plain view all the way down to when she was on the ground, which is a good 5, 6, maybe even 10 seconds, to when she was by the car trying to stab the girl. That's about 15, 20 seconds. Granted, that is quick, but that's not lightning fast. You can tell what's going on. You can at least try.
He does not know if this person, he just sees a young woman. He doesn't know it's a kid. He doesn't know the whole situation.
Well, right? No, but he has 3 other officers with him as well. I think we forget that.
I mean, he's not on his own. Yeah, he does not know, though. Sure, he's not on his own, but he does not know, and the other cops do not know if this person is going to charge them and start stabbing them. I mean, you can close. I mean, if you're within that range, right? Within that range, the person with the knife is on top of you before you can draw your weapon and shoot them at that range. If you run full out, that's like what? 10 yards maybe. Right, 10 yards maybe. You get to that in like a second. You can get there in about a second. And so the cop, he does, if you see him, he actually he says no, and he's backing off because he doesn't have and he's coming back to draw his gun because he doesn't know if this woman is going to charge him now that he's involved in the scuffle.
But the fact of the matter is, rather unfortunately, he chose to draw his gun.
Yeah.
Rather than attempt to disarm the assailant with the help of his fellow officers, which, for an incoherent 16-year-old girl, granted, not very predictable, but on the ground, not a major threat, because it's a 16-year-old girl again.
Well, yeah, you're sure.
Especially with 3 people who are very physically fit, who are trained to deal with this kind of situation specifically, as it is their job to do so.
Oh yeah,
I really do believe that they could have easily disarmed the girl in those seconds when she was on the ground, rather than waiting for her to get back up, attack another person, and then shoot her and take her life needlessly when it could have been avoided.
Yeah, so Walt just posted the thing I was referencing, which is from the beautiful film Surviving Edged Weapons, which you should all watch.
It's a beautiful movie.
It is a beautiful movie. It is the best educational film ever made. So yeah, I mean that's kind of the point. And like so like I think the tension in your view here is that even though she's on the ground, in order to restrain her, right? He's got to go into range of the knife. There are tons of arteries in your legs that she could stab. Your crotch, for example, is, the police don't wear athletic cups like baseball players do, or cricket players, I guess. Right? And so she's in perfect range to hit like a lot of connecting arteries in his groin area, right? And his legs too. I mean, the guy's going to get stabbed if he goes in there to restrain. So you say, okay, use a taser, right? Use a taser.
Well, it's not possible. It's not possible. Sorry, that was a Freudian slip. It's not impossible to say that he wouldn't have been stabbed, as he, again, did have backup of 3 or possibly 4 police officers behind him.
Right, and behind him is a critical point, right? Because bullets are fired in a straight line. You don't weave around shit, right? If he's on top of her trying to subdue her, then his buddy can't shoot her. He has to reposition so that he doesn't shoot through his buddy.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Right, and like the other thing, like you say, okay, use a taser, right? So like at least the situation that the situation you're painting, the picture you're painting is, look, they're by the door, right? Then she immediately comes and starts rushing the girl, right? Now she's on the ground over the girl, right? And then she goes and stabs the other person, tries to stab the other person, right? That's like the situation that you're saying, right?
Yeah,
essentially. So now it seems like anytime that someone is running towards another person, we should immediately pull out the taser and tase that person. And to a moving target at that speed with a taser shot, I mean...
Well, I'm not saying that it would be applicable for every situation, but considering she was running almost directly at the police officer as the woman was stood quite literally 2 feet to his right, I think that it would have been very applicable in that situation, because a moving target even coming straight towards you is still a fairly clean shot.
Right, but she's running at this person with a knife. So it seems like that this is a point where like, you should shoot her then, right? But he doesn't. He gives her a chance to not, and you see him back up, right? He backs up a little bit and says, "No, off." So she gets off, right? And then she immediately goes to try to stab another person. Right. So there's a moment there, right, when he says off or no or whatever he says, right? There's a moment there where the situation could have been over, right? She could have dropped the knife at that point and would have been over, I think, right? That's what should have happened.
Yeah, I'll agree with you on that.
And so in that moment, the officer is assessing if that's what this situation is going to turn into, and then it doesn't. Right? So like, again, sure, maybe if he should have just freaking tased her and said, "Screw it, I'm not even going to let you have the chance to not get tased. Let's just tase you, tase anybody anybody who's in a fight or whatever, just tase them indiscriminately," right? I guess.
I like the sound of that.
Okay. But I mean, I would prefer people not to get tased if they're going to give up their knife. And I mean, in such a split second, I really don't know if you're going to take the chance to pull out the taser and hope that the taser works while someone's, she's on top of the other lady by the time that the taser would have taken effect, right? Because, like, are we going to take the chance that the taser doesn't work and then shoot her? I mean, how long do we wait after we deploy the taser to see if it works or not? That's enough time to have someone stabbed. And, you can get stabbed up. I mean, if she's relatively strong, strong enough to pierce flesh, which she is, it was a pretty decent sized knife, that can cause some serious damage.
Yeah, true.
I mean, there's also a game theory calculation, right? Like, and this is, I think, the question for your side. And I mean, I think you're putting up a great effort here, but the question for your side is, what probability of grave bodily harm is acceptable for the innocent to withstand until we start dealing out, lethal force to the person who's doing the evil action? Like, what's the probability of someone getting gravely bodily harmed that is acceptable? And if it is acceptable for her to get stabbed once, is it acceptable for her to get stabbed 2 times? How much injury is required until lethal force is used?
Well, I'd say it's probably none. As much as I hate to say it, because it really just gives something to your point. If there is a strong chance of, grievous bodily harm that could lead to a lethality, then I don't think that the chance, honestly, should be taken. I kind of hate to betray my own argument, but asking me the question, in all honesty, I have to agree with you on that one. I do think that there does come a certain point wherein the life of an innocent is on the line and an action call needs to be taken. But what I'm wondering is, did he make the right action call, and did he hesitate in what he was doing?
Well, I mean, I think it's clear that he did hesitate in what he was doing when he set off and started backing up, right? Right, he did that.
But that's hesitation that could have potentially saved a life. I mean, she was running directly towards him. If he had pulled the gun then and aimed for a leg, I mean, granted, yes, there are lots of arteries and such in a leg. And I'm not giving you the VATS bullshit. I'm saying she was running directly at him. What, it takes 1-2 seconds to draw a gun, maybe 3-4 seconds to aim it. She's already at a close enough range that you've pretty much got a point-blank shot at somewhere that is going to be much less lethal and aiming center of gravity.
Yeah.
That could have easily restrained her. I mean, granted, she would still be dangerous. She would still have a knife and 2 working arms.
I mean, like, let's look, though. When she's running toward the cop, what's behind her? Other people.
It's a fair point.
So if he misses his leg shot or whatever...
Well, he misses his leg shot. He's aiming low. It was on a sloped driveway. The probability of hitting another person would have been quite low, because they were much higher than her legs would have actually been to aim at. Ricochet, granted, is a possible, or just flying up like rat shot. That is a possibility, but I think the risk of a potential minor injury to an innocent, and the very, very low risk, I'll say, of an individual accidentally being shot, especially at that close of a range when they were higher up, I don't really think there would be much chance with a trained police officer with a firearm. But if there was a chance, I think it's still better to try and take that chance than to just point blank kill a teenager with 4 straight shots to the chest, which I will say, good grouping, officer.
But I mean, but now we're making an argument to shoot people sooner.
Well, yeah, shoot people sooner, but in a less than lethal manner.
Right. And I've seen people tank more than 4 bullets shot in the chest, right? I mean, granted, he had good aim and probably hit some vital organs, pretty quickly. But I've seen people take shots to the lung and be fine for, still be able to stab, not be fine, but still be able to stab people for a good minute.
Well, it's what I'm saying. I mean, I don't necessarily think that taking a leg shot, A, could be lethal. It could have resulted in the same end. And B, she would still be a threat, because she would still have 2 working arms. She could easily still stab somebody, but it would make her much easier to restrain. And, we don't know. She's probably never been shot before. She's probably never even had any kind of blunt force trauma to her before, outside of what happens in her home. That would come as a major shock to her. And I think the chance of potentially ending that situation in a less than lethal manner would still be better than the outcome of just 4 shots straight to the center of gravity.
I mean, I think we all agree, right? I think that we all agree that if it was reasonably possible to use some non-lethal mechanism, you should. I think both of us agree on that.
Yeah.
Right? You shouldn't just shoot people, at every instance, right?
Yeah.
But what I am trying to say is, I think we need, and I still want an answer to this, is where does the line begin from using non-lethal means and using lethal means? And once we've set this, and once you've told me the standard, right? Once I can get my standard there, then we can then apply this situation and see if it fits the criteria.
Well, your standard, my standard at least, would be the British Police Forces one, wherein you use all non-lethal and less than lethal means available to you, and only then do you cross the line and you go into lethal force.
Okay, sure. Like that's a fine standard. And in this case, right, obviously we didn't go through all of our abilities for non-lethal, right? And so obviously by this standard, in this case, it would be unjustified, right? I would assume.
Yes, possibly. But if I could just ask for a brief recession period so I can grab a glass of water.
Oh, excellent. I'll get some water too. Most excellent.
Thank you. Right, one moment.
Perfect timing, it seems.
That was actually really well timed. Anyway, I'm glad you talked amongst yourselves, boys and girls. We'll now resume the debate.
Right. So, I mean, going on from what I was saying, this circles sort of back to the point I made at the first part of the debate, right? Is if you have, and let's change the situation a bit. Let's say the police are tracking psychopathic Dexter killer, right?
Right.
He has 5 people there, and he kills the first one in front of them, right? They tell him to stop. So that's one. They try to de-escalate the situation, right? Then he kills the next person, and they try the taser. That doesn't work. Then they shoot the beanbag rounds. That doesn't work. Again, this just seems to be a protecting the evil at the expense of the innocent.
Well, I hate to say it, but what you've almost perfectly described there is the Iranian hostage situation, in which lethal force was authorized after the killing of one hostage because we knew that they were serious. And I think, quite honestly, a big thing in this case is we don't actually know whether she would have stabbed them, because as we've seen, when the girl was on the ground, and granted, the police officer didn't have enough time to recognize the fact that she hadn't been harmed. You know, we can agree on that. But the point I'm trying to make is, you know, when we see her pin this girl up against the truck, you know, she's in her face for a solid 3 seconds. I mean, if you wanted to kill somebody, you've got 3 seconds next to them with a knife. You're going to stab them at least once or twice. It is very easy to rapidly stab somebody when you're pinning them against a truck. So it's a question that I've asked. I've rewatched that tape like 3 times now. I honestly couldn't tell you whether she was actually intending to threaten or to harm or to kill. I think that's just going to be one for the investigation, really. I don't think we can make a judgment on that. But I do think that
I mean, I don't think that, you know, like I don't think that we need intent to kill people here. I mean, I've already ceded that she's in a mental state where she's not aware of her actions. Right, sure. But I just don't see a reasonable police officer in this situation being I mean, I don't think it would be. So again, I think the audience is what's going to end up, like, the voters here are going to have to decide on this, right? Is should we take a wait and see attitude to people who are fighting or accosting another person with a knife? Like, should we take a wait and see approach to that? I mean, if your answer to that is yes, then I think that Prince Charles wins, right? But I just think that this is allowing allowing the bank robber to get away with some of the loot before calling the police about it, right? This is allowing the, harm to the good at the expense of the well-being of the bad.
Well, the one I disagree with your point greatly, because my point is primarily the fact that the police officer could have used less than lethal force, at least. I don't think that the full lethal force was entirely necessary in the situation. I think that he hesitated too long when she was charging at the girl with a knife. He knew she had a knife. I think that he should have just taken a shot right then, because there was an innocent life in danger. But at the same time, there was distance between them. She was a moving target, I'll grant you that, and the police unfortunately don't have access to that yet. When? Come on, Biden.
Right.
But,
let's hope.
But he had time. She was a moving target, but she was moving relatively, I'm not going to say perfectly because it's a human being, but relatively perpendicularly to him. He had time to draw his gun and take a less than lethal shot in that instance, and he didn't.
Well, I mean, I just don't think that this less than lethal shot idea is going to be good when we zoom out and we look at like what type of overall policies you're advocating for, because there's a very possible, and situations like this have happened, where we're in a very similar situation where the person isn't just trying to scare people. In this case, for instance, maybe she's just trying to scare them because she's fed up with it, right? That's the best, probably the best. It was a justified, rebellious, infliction of terror in response to her abuse, right? Like, this is probably the best picture we can paint of this situation, right? And we might even say, hey, in certain situations that might have been justified, right? You got to defend yourself if you're being abused. Sure, we can say that, right? You can say all that, but there's a multitude of other situations where this is just simply not true. And to say that, there are situations where people will stab the other person in this situation, right? And so the question is, in making this situation unjustified due to the possibility of it not being even an intent to harm someone else, for example, in the most beneficent way possible, right? And in deeming this situation unjustified due to that possibility, because the cop doesn't know this, right? We know this post facto, right? You end up making a lot of other situations which we would say post facto would have been justified in shooting the person, also unjustified, right? And that's the problem, is that this case is sort of on the borderline, right? Which is what makes it so interesting, and why it's captured the popular imagination, if you will. It's because it is this line walking case. But if we allow this case in, we have to cede a lot of ground that we don't after the fact, like on other cases, right? Make sense?
Yeah.
Very long-winded way of saying that.
But I'd still give the point that I do think to some degree that it is beneficial, especially to the police force, that perhaps sometimes you take a look and you say, well, less than lethal force could have been used here. It was the police officer's fault for not seeing that. But I do agree with you that in a lot of cases that would be, because a lot of these cases do walk the line, and this one especially, wherein it is just too close to tell. And I think that really both of us really are just speculating mostly on this, because we weren't there. We'll never actually know the full ins and outs of it and what was going through his head. But I do personally believe that a less than lethal approach was possible and could have saved that young girl's life.
I mean, unless we want to go into the weeds and try to justify or make unjustified this situation using specific moral theories and debating the merits of those theories, I think we've basically covered most, if not all, of the ground that we're going to cover. Do you have any other arguments for this? Because I really, you don't. Okay.
I don't. Please call closing statements.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying, because I think we're just going to be repeating at this point.
I'll let you take yours first.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, like, I really think that this debate comes down to, I mean, from you as a voter, right? I think that I mean, again, let's do some propositional analysis here, which we should always do, but people don't. If we look at the proposition, in order for me to win, you have to believe this statement, I think. I think you have to believe that I have, in some sense, made the statement's truth significantly more likely than its falsity, right? And I think that we both agree that the officer didn't commit a moral wrong, but the question is the police shooting situation itself justifiable given the evidence before us? And I really think that the answer to this question, the first part of the conjunction, is really going to be determined on your view of how high a probability of someone stabbing someone else, causing grave bodily harm, or actually causing some harm, right? In the case of the Iranian hostage crisis, right?
Hmm.
So the question is, where do you draw that line? And I think if you draw the line at the place where it becomes clear that there is a very high possibility that someone's getting stabbed, I think at that point, you're justified in shooting them, especially given the fact that someone is right there. I mean, when we're talking about suicide by cop cases, right? Usually these end up in the cops backpedaling backwards and the guy walking in the middle of the street, 15, we're talking like 20 to 30 feet away from them, right? So that's a different situation. And I think that that's perfectly compatible with the view to say that if someone has a high possibility of causing grave bodily harm to someone else, that's a justified time for the police can shoot someone, given the fact, right? I mean, when we see a lot of cases with taser use, right, those are usually cases where there isn't a knife involved, there isn't a weapon, there aren't people who are in physical contact, essentially fighting each other, right? We don't see that with the taser deployments. Usually we see those where it's usually the person has enough distance away from others that if they were to try to make a move on somebody else, there's still time to follow up with lethal force. And so I think that if you want to draw the line that, look, if someone's on top of somebody with a knife, making stabbing motions, runs to another person in the act of making a motion to stab someone else, if you really don't think there's any situation where it's justifiable for a police officer to take a shot there, then I think that you have to vote for me. But I mean, if you think that we should take a wait and see approach and wait for someone to get stabbed in the neck potentially and bleed out on the street because, hey, they may not have meant to stab them, then I think that you can safely vote for my opponent. And so that's the question that I think is the real voting question for you in the audience. And I'll close there.
Well, for my closing statement, I'd first like to vehemently object to your answer of a taser being used in close combat, because in actuality, there was a case in southeast London not a few years ago where a police officer was in a stairwell not about 6 feet from a man with a knife, with a pregnant woman behind him who was attempting to stab the police officer and was successfully tased. Unfortunately, the man died due to falling down the stairs, but the taser didn't kill him. So, they can be used in those kinds of situations. Granted, it may not have been possible in this exact situation. That's not necessarily something that we can say because, I mean, the taser wasn't used, so we don't know. It could have worked, it could not have worked. On top of that, I think that morally the killing was, I wouldn't say questionable, but slightly dubious due to the fact that, as I've said, there were potential lethal situations in which this case could have come with an outcome where nobody died. Granted, the girl would have had injuries and she would have had to go to a bloody psych ward, but she still would have been alive and could have been successfully treated. On top of that, I think the painting of her being evil or, being, the force of bad in this situation is entirely unjustified due to the fact that, as I've stated previously, she was in an abusive household surrounded by people who had come to the house specifically to perform physical abuse towards her. They'd come basically to jump her. Her father is seen being physically abusive to her in the tape. So I don't necessarily think that she can be painted as the bad guy. I think that she is just a very scared and depressed. And really, I think that if you believe that she wasn't necessarily, I'm not going to say entirely, but if she wasn't necessarily in the wrong, and there wasn't particularly a right in this case, then I think that you should vote for me. Because frankly, I think this entire situation was not justified in its entirety and was morally objectionable from the police shooting to how it even started. So I'll close on that. Thank you very much, everyone.
I also wanted to say thank you to my opponent. I really enjoyed the debate, and thanks to the audience as well.
Yeah, thank you, everyone, and thank you to my opponent. It was it went much better than I thought it was going to.
I told you.
I've used it before. I personally prefer the 3 question.
All right, do the 3 questions. Oh, are there any questions from the peanut gallery? We can field those while the vote's going on.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So my question is on the actual time that the officers had to communicate. This is for Prince Charles here, but I mean it opened to CoolDog as well. Given the dash cam footage and everything from the time that the officers were primed by dispatch for what they were going to be walking into, and then the time that they exit the vehicle and actually see what's unfolding before them, how much time do you think that they had to actually communicate before anything went down?
I think that they had a little bit of time before. Obviously, I've not seen the entire body cam footage. Nobody has. But I think that they had, I'd say, at least about 30 seconds before anything actually happened to communicate. And then when things were actually happening, I think they had about 10 to 15, 20 to push seconds. Obviously, I'm trying my best to remember the exact body cam footage. But I think that they had somewhere between 10 and 20 seconds to communicate effectively before all hell completely broke loose. So I think that they had time to communicate somewhat. However, whether they could fully communicate a plan of action or whether they could fully communicate some form of, I don't know, logistics or whatever you want to call it, debatable, granted. But I do think that they had some time to communicate.